How you doing, everyone, and welcome to Dreadnought, Gundam and more on PS4. And this is the first ever year-end review of Legendary gameplay meta for the game of Dreadnought on PS4. Now, this is something I've wanted to do for a long time. There have been some requests to do some tips videos for various games and various categories, but with all of the updates that have been happening in the game over the last year, I thought it would be nice to put out a general meta video for Legendary mode. And this could be translated down to Veteran mode as well, but you won't get access to some of the more critical modules that we're talking about in this discussion until you hit Legendary mode, and that would be Tier 4 to Tier 5. Before we get started, let's get into what exactly meta is, because there's a couple of different views and definitions out there on what we can consider Dreadnought meta. For instance, it might be considered meta by some to have certain actions of captains and certain ships that commonly do a specific build, whether it's the starting build or a build that they have easy access to, but it's not very effective. One example of this would be the Vigo gameplay that took place during the November Direct Dreadnought game and channel monthly update, in which 3 Vigos were using some questionable tactics and builds to attack me and my team in Elysium while I was piloting a Grenada. Even though there may be a commonality of tactics and modules, that doesn't mean that they're effective. On the other side of the spectrum, we have some pseudo clan play, like from the Space Apes, that completely dismiss certain tactics and ships that are quite effective in normal gameplay, but are not necessarily effective against them, and so they do not consider that meta, even if those ships are very effective or those builds or tactics are very effective in most gameplay environments as far as Dreadnought is concerned. So, in order to split the difference, I think we're going to go with Grammarly's definition of meta, and that is, in the world of gaming, the term meta is used 2 ways. Meta can be used as an acronym for most effective tactics available, and calling something meta means that it's an effective way to achieve the goal of the game, whether it's to beat other players or to beat the game itself. And I really like that definition because it includes the most efficient way to play your game, but also includes any or an effective way to get the job done. And I think that's a great definition. So, what we're going to do in this video is we are going to go over the meta for each ship briefly, but also include the meta for each class of ship, and then I'm going to pick, after all the changes that have been done to the game, I'm going to choose the ship that I think is the current forerunner of its class with all the various balance patches that we've got, which I believe we are up to 8 in just the last 6-7 months, so that's quite a bit. What's also important about meta is that this is not just a guide on what modules are commonly played by most mid to high level players in Dreadnought, but it's also something that you should pay attention to so you know what to look for so that you can counter the most commonly effective builds per ship. So you always want to have, in most of my tips and strategy videos, I clearly say that you really want to have all 5 ships occupying your fleet when you enter a game, and you want to have both A and B variants for each ship, and having a B variant that is a specific counter to meta gameplay in Dreadnought is a very effective way to stay alive and to counter team tactics and advanced players from dominating the game. I'm going to include on the screen right now some jumping points in the video if you don't want to watch the entire video and want to focus on a specific class of ship. Go ahead and jump to these time points that you see on the screen right now. Well, let's jump right in, and first we are going to cover the Destroyer class. There hasn't been many changes to destroyers lately. In fact, it's one of the most stable ships in the game, and it's a very popular ship in the game, which also means that you have a huge swing of players that are really strong in a destroyer, and then you have other really top tier players that think destroyers are actually underrated and underpowered. And you may find that hard to believe when you suffer a catastrophic Brutus ram, but these players have the know-how and the capability of completely disabling the tactics of a destroyer and quickly bringing these ships down. So we have very mixed reviews on how effective destroyers are in general, but I think the average player base is fairly effective in the destroyer. I believe I'm pretty experienced with destroyers, and I think they still hold a place in the game for average common gameplay in Legendary mode. The idea with the destroyer, which makes it such an interesting class, is that they have access to the same amount of modules that any other class has access to, but each destroyer uses those modules in very, very different ways. We'll get into how some of the other classes use modules, but you will find that these other classes use modules very much the same, and it's their ship that's different from company to company. But with destroyers, how the destroyers use these modules is very, very different and exciting. So first, of course, we have the Vigo and the Athos. My favorite ship in the game is, of course, the Athos, but that doesn't mean it's currently the best. The current meta for the Athos is to use its gun power to maximum advantage, which means most players that are really good Athos captains want to keep their distance from the enemy as much as possible and to maximize the amount of firepower and DPS that their ship is putting out. Putting extra reinforcement onto the ship or doing things like that really doesn't help them out. They want to keep that distance away from the enemy, and the two best ways to do that is, of course, with evasive maneuvers and or stasis ammo. Stasis ammo can freeze Brutuses and Corvettes, so you can nail them with your gunpowder or hit them with missiles, and evasive maneuvers removes you from the bad situation, keeping distance from you and the enemy. And with the Athos and the Vigo, Nerves of Steel also helps to do that, as you will be backpedaling a lot, moving with powered engines away from your enemy and using your firepower. If they do land hits, that makes you go only that much faster. You want maximum range missiles. I used to use the missile repeaters quite a bit. They have an excellent range and very devastating firepower and can retract, and they're still very good missiles. However, Tempest missiles are really good at long range, and the new buffs to the Scylla torpedo make it very dangerous and very effective at doing damage at long range, having a blast radius to take out pods and the like, and also keep the distance between you and your enemy while maximizing firepower from your main guns. And I think that's just great. Krizali and Captain Crank are very good users of the Scylla torpedo, and I have made the switch as well. You also want to be using, of course, flechettes or disruptor missile. And for your third slot, one of the more popular options is, of course, weapon booster pulse, but with all the nukes flying around and all the missiles and disruptor missiles from ships like Brutus's, Hell lasers are exceptionally popular as well. So the meta with the Athos and the Vigo is to keep your distance, long range firepower, maximize your damage per second, and of course get maximum distance away from your enemy and use missile and nuke counters wherever possible. Next, of course, we have the ship that probably has so much angst attached to it and hatred from so many players, the Brutus. The Brutus has the exact same module loadout that any other destroyer does, but it is the close-range destroyer, whereas the Athos and the Vigo are long-range destroyers that are capable of even attacking artillery cruisers at long range. The Brutus and the Invictor are short-range killers and are almost always using rams, sometimes, like me, but not as common as ram tactics, you will see flash torpedoes. but you definitely want the disruptor missile to get in there and make sure there are no surprises when you complete your close assault. And of course, you usually want a scramble or a drain pulse so that you either surprise the enemy or take down their shields in case something goes wrong. You usually want to use evasive maneuvers as well, or engine booster for the Vindicta and the Brutus. You don't want to be caught out at long range. Some players do like to use anti-missile lasers, but they're not very common, and it's usually tactics and cover that'll save the day with the Vindicta and the Brutus. And of course, you want to get that RAM in there, so you want to use officer briefings like module recycler, module amper, anything that boosts the power of your primary attack or lowering the cooldown of your primary modules. But a lot of people think that although the Brutus and the Vindicta are very effective, they are one-trick ponies, although the Space Apes think that it is the only destroyer that's currently relevant in the game. Next, let's move on to Akula Vector's Gora the Destroyer, and of course the Blood. This destroyer has to be my pick for overall the best destroyer in the metagame as far as Dreadnought's concerned in Legendary gameplay. This is the destroyer that can use just about any module at any range. Now, of course, you can use a ram with a Vigo or a ram with the Gora, and it's not as effective and it won't do as well as with the Vindicta or the Brutus, and therefore it's not meta. But I believe the Gora and the Blood have the best overall access to modules. They can do stuff at short range, like with flash torpedoes or a normal torpedo salvo. They can do things at long range just as effective as the Athos with Tempest missiles or Scylla torpedoes. They can get that mid-range game with missile repeaters and flechettes. They can use status missiles as well. They have access to just about anything you want as far as proximity modules. You can use anti-missile lasers. You can use weapon booster pulse. Really, the name of the game for meta as far as the Akula Vector destroyers goes is survivability, staying in that mid-range, and using things such as energy generator or other things that add to your defense to stay in there, because you may not be able to leave a fight once you get in there, but to press the advantage of your hull while dishing out as much firepower as possible. So even though you do have my particular build, which is fairly mobile and gives my Gora a bodacious booty as far as its giant hull pool points, and you also have Valoris's build, which uses Retaliator along with Energy Generator and a nearby healer to just absorb damage and get near instant modules. But the current meta with this destroyer is to use medium to long range missiles, supplement it with anti-laser defenses or something to boost your guns, and of course using stasis ammo to freeze your targets so they can't get away from you. Overall, I would have to say that the Akula Vector Destroyer is a masterpiece in the current game meta, and it's the destroyer that has the most options for gameplay and is the most survivable while also dishing out a lot of punishment. This is the destroyer that can absorb assault blink warps and rams and still kill their opponent at the end of the day. And that's the name of the game with meta as far as Akula Vector goes, and that's survivability. Now let's take a look at Dreadnoughts. Dreadnoughts are probably the most iconic ship of the game, but with this last patch for the fall patch, we have to conclude that the meta of Dreadnoughts has changed quite a bit, save for one particular ship, and we will get into that in a little bit. First, we'll take a look at Akula Vector Dreadnoughts. Now, where Akula Vector has kind of claimed the destroyer class as its masterpiece, I have to say that although the Zeme is kind of the mascot of the game, it's in a very troubled spot right now. The old meta with the Zeme was usually to count on both armor booster pulse and armor amplifier to get a near unstoppable Dreadnought where it could alternate the two or activate both of them at the same time to become invulnerable, and then to use officer briefings such as desperate measures to rinse and repeat and have nukes at the ready and all sorts of great things. But now, where there is no such thing as perfect invulnerability in the game, the meta of the Voronezh and the Zeme are in a little bit of a flux. Many players still choose to use the Tartarus missile or the normal nuke with its improved blast radius to devastate the enemy, and you still see both armor amplifier and armor booster pulse used by many players. But it is starting to change, and you are starting to see many players use assault thrusters to get the Zeme going very, very fast, where it has just enough hit points and hull to sustain a lot of damage with armor booster pulse, while simultaneously delivering very, very catastrophic punishment at close range with broadsides. You don't usually see strikecraft used with Akula Vector Dreadnoughts, but you are going to see a little more of things like tractor beams and, of course, anti-missile lasers. I've been seeing that quite a bit. So the Akula Vector Dreadnought kind of has lost its way as far as the meta. You still want to use its superior hull and its superior access to armor boosting modules, but right now there is no one kind of Akula Vector Dreadnought out there, and I think they're taking a back seat to the other two Dreadnoughts, and it's going to take a little bit of time to flesh out their meta. But you can't go wrong with this ship, as it's got decent firepower, even though the repeaters got a nerf, and its guns are notoriously inaccurate unless you're a professional with them. And of course, you can still count on armor booster pulse and armor amplifier, but more damage is getting through now that there's no such thing as perfect invulnerability. Now let's go to Oberon's Dreadnoughts, which are very powerful, and of course you can end the line of their Dreadnoughts with the Invictus at tier 5, and the guns on these two ships are very, very good. You're getting DPS that now rivals Akula Vector and Jupiter Arms destroyers, which is quite impressive, but it is still very, very squishy. So I see a lot of players trying to min-max, where they are trying to either make no attempt at using armor boosting modules and instead are going with assault thrusters and going with tractor beam or stasis pulse. I also see other Dreadnoughts using armor boosting modules, keeping at a distance and using strikecraft, or you see Dreadnoughts that like to fly into the middle of the fray and to have very, very strange effects using bombers and, of course, stasis pulse and other things. But the name of the game for this ship as far as meta goes is to put as much damage as possible with your guns, which means you shouldn't be using repeaters anymore. You want to use the main guns, and you want to use something like flak at close range. Nerves of steel are particularly good with this ship, as when you're trying to get away and you have power to engines, you go that much faster. Assault thrusters is good, but watch out, you're super squishy. Or you can go the other way and keep your distance using the gun's maximum range at 7 kilometers to deal pretty darn good damage, just a hair over 2,000 DPS, while also delivering strikecraft and saving those armor modules so that you can get away if someone gets too close. So not much has changed with this particular Dreadnought, but it's using its speed and firepower, which got a huge buff a couple of patches ago, to stay alive. Now my best pick for the category of Dreadnoughts has to be, and it's been this way for a while, the Jupiter Arms Jutland and Monarch. And I have to say, jumping Jutlands and jumping Monarchs are the way to go, but I have seen many players, including myself, do the super brick kind of thing, where if you're in a map that's very small and you don't need to move much, and you're guarding something like a command ship and you have a healer nearby, you can use armor booster pulse and armor amplifier, and even though there's no such thing as perfect invulnerability, with things like reinforced and retaliator, you can just continue to absorb the damage and increase your score with smooth sailing, berserker, and the like, even frontline freak a whole bunch. But even though that is some minor meta of the game and is still very, very common out there, when we're talking about the masterpiece of Dreadnoughts currently in the game of Dreadnought, you are talking about Jupiter Arms and the Jutland and the Monarch. And that's because these ships can come in and totally disrupt an enemy team, take out a command ship, brutally hunt down and destroy artillery cruisers, which are supposed to be the nemesis of Dreadnoughts, take down destroyers in one-on-one combat, and sometimes even make it out alive. And we have seen in some of the player-submitted replay casts on the channel that the Jutland and the Monarch are extremely effective at this. They have a huge hull point pool, which means that you can use Armor Booster Pulse, but the meta is now going more towards using Stasis Pulse and using the Jump Generator. And even though other Dreadnoughts can use the Jump Generator, most of the time they don't, because it's usually a one-way trip. But with the Jutland and the Monarch, jump is the way to go, and that is the most common means of using this ship, and it's extremely effective, and no other ship in the game really does what Jupiter Arms Dreadnoughts do. They typically like to use, you sometimes see some playing around with Strikecraft, but not really. It's usually Triad pods for your secondary weapon module, and your primary module is some sort of broadside, usually plasma broadside, to get that spike of damage, but also fairly common is ballistic broadside if you want to stay in the thick of it. So normally you want ballistic broadside along with Armor Booster Pulse, or plasma broadside along with Stasis Pulse. And for both of those, you probably want to be using Triad pods to make a very effective ship. This is the ship that, unlike other Dreadnoughts where they can have a bad life, they die, respawn, go in, and die again, don't get much done. Even if you don't kill a ship and you die in the Jupiter Arms Dreadnoughts, you have usually created such a distraction and so much havoc that your team can capitalize on your distraction. And if you survive and take a couple ships out, you can zoom back to your team, get healed up, and go in again. So I think as far as meta is concerned, the best Dreadnought out there has to be Jupiter Arms. Next, let's take a look at artillery cruisers. Now, what I love about artillery cruisers is that they are almost the exact opposite of the meta for destroyers. Where destroyers have access to a pool of modules, and those destroyers use those modules in very different ways, but for the most part, the destroyers themselves are ships that put out damage with their main guns and then use modules to finish players off. And even though they are different from type to type and use those modules differently, you know a destroyer when you see it. With artillery cruisers, really the artillery cruiser itself is so different from its other two ships in class by the other mega corporations, but each artillery cruiser uses their module pool just about the same. It's very rare to see a huge difference in the use of modules for artillery cruisers. They usually either want to do a lot of damage to you, or they want to survive an up-close personal battle with a corvette or destroyer. So for the most part, artillery cruisers are using the same modules for the same purposes. You see, it's very common to use bomb catapult. You do see people trying to use mine catapult, but it's not as effective. It's much harder to use, and it's much more common to see bomb catapult. Right now, the go-to primary module has to be disruptor auto beams. If you're not using bomb catapult, you're using disruptor auto beams, even more than stasis auto beams. Disruptor auto beams is where it's at. I don't know why it works better, it just works better. As soon as you take people's modules away, it throws off their game. I used to use stasis auto beams to freeze targets so I could shoot them better, but seeing so many other players using the disruptor beam meta, I since switched as well, and it works a lot better. It just completely throws most players off, and they just want to get out of there. They want to get away from you, and that in and of itself is an accomplishment for this module because it's keeping you safe. Some very, very experienced professional players like Persistent Flame and Scroat will press the attack and go after you even if their modules are done, but most players, as soon as you hit them with disruptor auto beams, they just want to get away from you, and that helps keep you alive. The way to go as far as your third module slot is almost always, with very few exceptions, either anti-missile pulse or hell lasers, anti-nuke lasers. And the only real difference from ship to ship as far as module use has to be using evasive maneuver on Jupiter Arms artillery cruisers, because they have such a hard time of moving side to side to keep their aim because they're such a slow ship. So most of the Jupiter Arms artillery cruiser players prefer to use evasive maneuvers to dodge enemy fire, but more importantly to reposition themselves in between reloads for their next shot. And of course, the most commonly used module in the last slot for the other two artillery cruisers, which would be Oberon and Akula Vector, has to be the armor amplifier. That's the way to go, especially when you have Akula Vector. It's very tanky, very hard to hit, and that just amplifies things. Evasive maneuvers not very good on Akula Vector artillery cruisers. They just don't move far enough, and it's kind of a waste where you're already hard to hit. You can hang out high in the sky getting really good aim, and when someone finally gets a bead on you, you can put on the armor amplifier and just drop down and get out of danger. Same thing but slightly different with Oberon. Oberon, as soon as you corner them, they'll put armor amplifier up and then just all powered engines and zoom away from you with that superior mobility. So the only real difference between these ships is not your build, but how the actual ship plays itself. A long time ago, we got a boost for range, which I think was very, very necessary, and that was on Jupiter Arms artillery cruisers. You want to stay between 8 and 8.6 kilometers away so you don't get return fire, and you can just keep the damage coming. You're nice and safe, and with that evasive maneuver, when someone shoots at you, you have more time to dodge out of the way because the shot has to travel to you, and you can just keep moving sideways in the same direction and making either a clockwise or counterclockwise motion to keep up with your team while circling the enemy at long range. Akula Vector likes to move up and down because they're exceptionally hard to hit with their small hitbox and target profile. And when they do finally corner you, you can, of course, use your armor amplifier. And I don't want to forget that one of the most common modules used in the secondary slot has to be proximity mines. There are some players that use status missiles, and that's okay, especially drain missiles. But right now, proximity mines are where it's at because at worst, you suicide an incoming Corvette, and at best, they walk right into it and you get away scot-free. So it's very rare to see someone not using these lately, but you have to watch out for blast pulse and nukes because they'll set it off and kill you that way with your own mines. But as far as artillery cruisers go, I have to say that the new star of the show as far as meta is concerned has to be Oberon, Stabia, and of course Oberon's Tier 4 artillery cruiser. These now have competitive damage with their longer range, stronger brothers in this class, but they are much more forgiving. If you miss the first shot with the Akula Vector artillery cruiser, you have to wait several seconds to fire again, and you whiffed and got nothing. Jupiter Arms, you get a second shot at Tier 5, but it's really hard to land the second shot, and sometimes you hit the first, miss the second. But with Oberon artillery cruisers, you are very forgiving because you have 6 to 8 shots to hit with. Each one does less damage, but they fire very quickly, and if you miss the first couple, you can correct your aim and get a bead on your target, and it's very, very distracting. It's very, very tough as a player receiving that damage. And when you start getting hit by Oberon artillery cruisers, you kind of just want to get out of there. And what really makes Oberon so good is their ability to flank and keep moving. You can either strafe in the sky, making you very hard to hit, or quickly sneak around using cover and get to the side or even behind enemy formations and take them out, and then shoot and scoot and get out of there before anyone can come after you. And you have enough speed to even run away from corvettes and set mines behind you, so they're more likely to chase and less likely to notice the mines. So I have to give the meta artillery cruiser category, because of several patches a few months ago, to Oberon artillery cruiser in legendary gameplay for Dreadnought. Next, let's move on to tactical cruisers. The big news with tactical cruisers is that the artillery pod has been somewhat nerfed in that it's much easier to hit and destroy. The bad news is everyone still uses artillery pods. You are going to get some very crafty or creative players that don't use artillery pods, or maybe they just hate the meta and want to redefine the game and rebel against what's going on. But everyone hates artillery pods. They're very effective, therefore tactical cruisers use them. Now, as far as the other modules that tactical cruisers use, it really depends on whether you're Jupiter Arms or a healer. Jupiter Arms we're going to save for last, but let's look at what the healers can do. First, Akula Vector, of course, has the Space Potato, the Koshei, and the Octa. The Space Potato is the #1 healer when you are protected, but if you are out there alone, not using team or squad tactics, you are a big fat target. You are juicy for artillery, twice as juicy for corvettes, and still pretty meaty and delicious to destroyers and dreadnoughts too. But you have the best healing, so you have two choices. You can either min-max and be the best darn healer out there, or try to mount some defense. Most players don't bother with a defense. When they go Octa or Koshei, they go maximum healing. You're talking, of course, artillery pod, healing pod, repair auto beam, or blast pulse. And because it's so slow, you want to use the target warp so that you can get to the players that know who you are and want to defend you, because you're healing them and you're on their squad. So with the Space Potato, you really want to be a hot potato and jump around, but still use the same meta tactics that Oberon healers are going to use. While we're talking about Oberon tactical cruisers, we're going to say just about the same thing, but most players don't target warp, even though many do. Most players use energy generator on their Oberon tactical cruisers, and for the most part they heal just like the Koshei does, except they will go after some corvettes because they do have some damage to their main weapon. Some of them will even use rupture beam, but usually it's, of course, artillery pod, healing pod, repair pod, and either blast pulse or repair auto beams and energy generator, so you can zip around the field that much faster, or throw your shields up at the last minute when you're attacked by an Oberon destroyer or by a dreadnought nuke. So now we're getting to Jupiter Arms, which is the oddball out as far as tactical cruisers go. The old meta for Jupiter Arms was, of course, the stealth bomber, and let me tell you, emergency evac is still a great module for those of you who can work it into your build, but you don't see that as much anymore. The new meta, of course, is to use artillery pods, to use blast pulse, healing pods so that you can heal yourself in some way. You don't normally see flechettes. Sometimes you will see a nuke mine, but it's still pretty rare. Most Jupiter Arms tacticals want to be frontline, throwing up the energy generator to get shields and to pump out healing pods and artillery pods that much faster while shooting, and also using blast pulse at close range. Even though you do sometimes see the oddball stealth bomber build, usually with Jupiter Arms tacticals you're seeing some of them with healing beams, but normally just healing through pods, using artillery to hit slow-moving targets while they chase down quicker targets and finish them off with the blast pulse. I personally love Jupiter Arms tactical cruisers like I love the Athos. I think it's very effective. I have a couple of very interesting builds with them, and my favorite is the healing build, but I'm going to have to give the prize for tactical cruiser category as far as Dreadnought meta and Legendary is concerned to the Oberon tactical cruisers. And let me tell you, no one does it better. Sure, the Space Potato can heal better. Sure, the Jupiter Arms tactical cruiser is in a league of its own. But the Feronia and the Tier 4 Oberon tactical cruiser still puts out damage. They can still hit and attack corvettes and other ships to finish them off, so they can sometimes fend for themselves. They are fast enough to keep up with other ships. They still launch artillery pods, still have really good healing, and are fairly nimble and decently hard to hit when they're being the little space bunny and they're moving up and down and bouncing around the battlefield at speed, using, of course, Retaliator and Nerves of Steel to get the job done. So that's going to have to take it for the most meta tactical cruiser in Dreadnought currently. And that leaves Corvettes, saving the best for last. Just kidding, everyone hates Corvettes. You either hate them because you're awful at them, or you hate them because someone else is way better than you with them. And of course, what is weird about Corvettes is even though they can't be any more different, some say they're maybe a little too different from each other, they all pretty much have the same module meta. The name of the game is Assault Blink Warp or Thrust Amplifier. The name of the game is Blast Pulse or Disruptor Pulse. Every single good build out there has afterburners, and if you're not using afterburners, you are either a genius and you're very creative, or you don't understand the game very well. And sometimes you see some variation with the secondary weapon, but for the most part you are using torpedo salvo either 4 or 5. So you know how I feel about the Strybog. I thought it was the worst ship in the game, the worst ship in Tier 4 at least, but the Strybog is still a decent corvette if you know how to use it. The Netron is much better, and the name of the game is that Tier 5, for not just a Kula Vector, but all the corvettes, has access to the bolt guns, which is very meta and very game-changing. Even though a lot of players still use the plasma turrets, it's really the bolt guns that are the game changer in Tier 5, and that's what the vast majority of really good players and even average ones use. So for all three of these ships, it's the bolt guns, but with the Netron, the bolt guns really make the Netron so much better than the Strybog, and there's a world of difference between the two. The Strybog and Netron are very, very rugged, and you can build around that, but for the most part, you just want to use the extra pool of hull points to get you in and get you out because of its awful abysmal turn radius, and because afterburners is pretty much a staple. You are usually just going in and using those hull points to get in, do an assault blink warp, and get out safely. You can do tremendous amount of damage with the very inaccurate but very powerful two-shot rockets, and of course you still have access to blast pulse in case you overshoot your target. Very rarely do you see a Kula Vector corvettes using disruptor pulse. It's almost always blast pulse and torpedo salvo, and of course afterburners to get out of trouble, and usually but not always assault blink warp. Now we get to a love-hate relationship with Oberon corvettes. Now, as the Medusa is probably one of the best corvettes, if not the best, in Tier 4 compared to the Strybog, which is the worst, we get to the Mithras in Tier 5, which in my opinion, and many players' opinions, is just awful. It really counts on its module to do the damage because its main guns are so lackluster. So it's basically using the same modules as any other corvette to do its job. It's just doing it worse because the ship itself is slow, doesn't have the firepower of the Jupiter arms corvettes at mid to close corvette range, or doesn't have the firepower spike that the Aquila Vector corvettes do. It just doesn't do it. It's pretty slow, easy to hit, and when you see one coming, it's so easy to predict an assault blink warp. So most seasoned Mithras captains are using thrust amplifier to get out of trouble and to keep a distance while circling targets, to use either bolt guns or their main guns, but almost always you're just using bolt guns. Of course, they still use blast pulse and torpedo salvo. Once in a while you will see drain torpedoes, but very rarely, and of course you're using afterburner to get out of trouble. So the Jupiter arms corvettes do the same thing as any of these other corvettes do with the same module builds, but has the firepower and the speed. And even though these corvettes are very different, that doesn't mean each of them are effective, unlike the artillery cruisers and destroyers, which are very different from each other but very effective in their own category. The Nevis particularly is nothing special compared to its tier 4 brother. It only brings a little bit more damage, a little bit more armor, but both of these Jupiter arms corvettes are exceptional at what they do. They can either assault blink warp after delivering devastating firepower to you, or they can just count on their ship's firepower and then use thrust amplifier to zoom in, zoom out, get away, get out of danger, or use that in conjunction with bolt guns to do what the Mithras tries to do on a good day. So I really have to award the very stale meta of corvettes currently to Jupiter arms, especially the Nevis. It has the firepower, it has the speed. If it gets into trouble, it can afterburner away. It can use module recycler along with assault blink warp, just like the Netron can, but it just does it better. It's easier to aim with the assault blink warp, it's easier to get away, it's easier to maneuver, it's easier to move and hide tactically and strategically. It has superior firepower, access to the bolt guns, and still has blast pulse or disruptor pulse along with torpedo salvo and thrust amplifier if you don't like assault blink warp. So I have to give it to Jupiter arms in this category. When you're talking about corvette meta, you're talking about in and out, firepower and get out of danger, getting that kill and retreating. Stealth really isn't meta anymore. Some of these other things, armor amp was meta when it was overpowered for a little bit, but that only lasted a little while. And then of course you have other modules that are novel and some players use them well, but really when you're talking about Persistent Flame, Scrote, Valorous, Seba, Dude VT, General Nemesis, these guys, especially Yulce, by the way, I almost forgot Yulce, forgive me. Thanks a bunch, Yulce, you know I'm a big fan. The assault blink warp or thrust amplifier along with blast or disruptor pulse and afterburner and torpedo salvo is the way to go. And when you're using that module build, it's decent on the Netron, but it's really, really good on the Nevis. Well, there we have it, folks. That's the current state of the meta in the game of Dreadnought for PS4. If you disagree with me or have other opinions, please leave them below. I'm not the only authority or expert or just good player out there. Most of you are very good. Some of you are way better than me, and there's a lot of different points of view. But the important takeaway here is what to expect and what other players are using. These are the effective builds and modules for the best ships in class, so that you know how to go into each match with the best capable build to get the job done. You may be able to come up with the best build out there, and something that no one else has even thought of, and you should. You should be experimenting. But this is what you should expect from most of the decent players and some of the very best that are out there right now. And if you know what kind of trend and what kind of gameplay they are doing to be effective and to beat other players in the game of Dreadnought, you can either emulate that, or more importantly, you can devise counters to those builds. And if you know what to expect, you already have an ace in the hole. You already know the strategy of your enemy. You already know, chances are, what they are bringing to the table, and you know what to expect and how to counter it. And I think that's the most important takeaway in this video. It's good to know what everyone else is doing to be effective, but it's more important to know what the intentions are of your opponent so that you have the advantage. Well, that's it from me for now, and I'll see you soon in Sinley Bay.